It begins with a love story almost too perfect to question. A young girl on a quiet Greek island, and a man who seemed to step straight out of a dream. He was a helicopter pilot. Older, charming, confident. She was still in school, wide-eyed, hopeful, believing she had found the person she would spend the rest of her life with. Friends saw them together and whispered, "They look happy." Her family trusted her judgment. Social media showed sunsets, vacations, a wedding, and later, a newborn baby asleep between them. From the outside, it looked like a fairy tale. But inside a small home outside Athens, in the early hours of a Tuesday morning, everything changed. A man called emergency services with tape over his mouth. A baby cried beside her mother's motionless body. A dog hung from the staircase. Drawers were ripped open. A security camera lay on the couch, torn from the wall. And a Monopoly box, where the family kept their savings, sat empty. A husband, tied up on the bedroom floor, told police the same story again and again. Strangers had broken in. Strangers had taken the money. Strangers had killed his wife. And for 37 days, an entire nation believed him. They believed his tears at the funeral. They believed his trembling voice in interviews. They believed the photos of a perfect family shattered overnight. Detectives searched for armed intruders. The media warned the public. A country lived in fear, convinced a ruthless gang was on the loose. But while the world looked outward, the truth sat quietly inside that house. A memory card removed hours before the break-in. A smartwatch on Caroline's wrist recording her final moments. A fitness app tracking footsteps during a time he claimed to be helpless. And a diary filled with thoughts she never spoke aloud. Piece by piece, the story began to shift. Piece by piece, everything he said began to crumble. This is not the tale of masked men who vanished into the night. This is the story of a young woman who thought she had found her forever, and of the man who made sure she would never walk away. Her name was Caroline Crouch. And this is how the murder that captured the world was finally uncovered. Caroline Crouch was born in Athens, but her heart belonged to the island of Alanissos. It was here, on a quiet stretch of blue coastline, that she spent her childhood. Her parents, David, a retired engineer, and Susan, a devoted mother, had moved the family there when Caroline was 8. They wanted a life by the sea, far away from noise and concrete, and Caroline embraced it completely. She learned to swim before most children learned to ride bicycles. She grew up chasing sunlight across the water, spending afternoons snorkeling, diving, exploring the edges of the island like it was her own endless playground. Her world was small, peaceful, and safe. Everyone on Alanissos knew everyone else. Children walked to school without fear, and on weekends, the smell of the sea mixed with the sound of music drifting from the village square. Caroline was bright, active, and full of plans. She dreamed of studying, traveling, building a life filled with adventure. At home, she was surrounded by love, the kind that stays steady through every change, every moment of growing up. But life has a way of shifting in an instant. And that shift began the day she met a man far older than her, far more confident, and living a life completely different from the one she knew. His name was Babis Anagnostopoulos. He didn't grow up on an island. He didn't live in a world of simple routines and familiar faces. He flew helicopters, traveled frequently, and carried himself with the ease of someone who always got what he wanted. The first time he appeared in Caroline's life, it was sudden, a moment she couldn't have predicted, and one her family would later replay again and again, searching for signs they missed. What began as admiration soon became attention. And what began as attention slowly turned into a relationship that would take her away from the island she knew, the friends she trusted, and the safety she had always felt. Caroline believed she was stepping into a story most people only dream about. She didn't know she was stepping into a life that would pull her further and further from everything that once protected her. A life that would one day place her in a house outside Athens. In the early hours of the morning, with no one to save her, Caroline was in high school when their paths crossed. She was still a teenager, living on an island where every face was familiar and every routine felt the same. Then one day, something unusual happened, something that stood out from the quiet rhythm of island life. A helicopter passed overhead. Children pointed. Teachers stopped mid-sentence. And among the crowd, Caroline looked up too. Inside that helicopter was Babis, older, self-assured, already established in a world she had barely begun to understand. A pilot, a man who traveled often, a man who carried himself with pride and confidence. To a young girl, it didn't just feel impressive. It felt extraordinary. Over the months that followed, he became more involved in her life. He visited the island more frequently. He charmed her family. He presented himself as someone stable, capable, reliable. Someone who could give her the world. And Caroline, young, trusting, and full of hope, believed she had found the person meant for her. Their relationship moved quickly. Too quickly for some. But to Caroline, it felt like stepping into a dream she didn't want to question. She left the island behind and followed Babish to the city. Away from her childhood home. Away from the comfort of familiar voices. Away from the world that had always protected her. By July of 2019, Caroline and Babish made a decision that surprised everyone. They eloped. No large wedding. No Greek traditions. No family celebration. Just the two of them, quietly exchanging vows far from home. Photos from that time show a young couple smiling, hands intertwined, the sea behind them. To the outside world, they looked like two people deeply in love. Soon after, their life grew even fuller. Caroline became pregnant. She posted pictures of her growing belly. Babish posted pictures too, always smiling, always presenting the image of a perfect marriage. When their daughter was born, the picture became complete. A young mother, a proud father, and a baby girl with bright eyes. Caroline held her child close, determined to give her the life she deserved. And there was more to look forward to. The couple bought a plot of land, imagining the house they would build together. A home for their daughter. A place to grow old. They saved money, kept it hidden in a simple Monopoly box. A small detail that would later become a tragic centerpiece in the story. From the outside, everything seemed ideal. A pilot. A beautiful young wife. A new baby. A future filled with plans and promise. But beneath the surface, there were cracks no one could see. Moments Caroline kept quiet. Thoughts she wrote in private. Doubts she never voiced beyond the pages of her diary. Still she stayed. She hoped. She tried to believe in the life she had chosen. And as the world watched their smiling photos online, no one could imagine how quickly that fairy tale would collapse. Or the fear Caroline felt in the final hours of her life. Because on a quiet night in a quiet home outside Athens, everything that looked beautiful from afar was about to come apart forever. It was just after 4 a.m. when the silence inside the house broke. Caroline was asleep in the bedroom, their infant daughter resting beside her. Down the hallway, Babish slept too. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of stillness that makes every sound seem louder, every movement sharper. And then, according to Babish, it began. He later told investigators he was startled awake by the movement of strangers inside the house. Strangers he had never seen before. Strangers who wore hoods and carried guns. He claimed they rushed toward him before he could react. That they pinned him down. That they bound his wrists and ankles, wrapping tape across his eyes and mouth, tightening rope around his neck until he drifted in and out of consciousness. He said the men demanded money. That they knew exactly what they were looking for. That they shouted in accents he recognized but could not clearly place. Caroline woke to the sound of voices and footsteps. A moment of confusion. Then fear. Then panic as the intruders moved toward her. Their baby cried, startled by the chaos around her, tiny hands reaching upward, not understanding the danger. According to the story Babish shared, the intruders were violent and impatient. They wanted the couple's savings, the money they had hidden in a Monopoly box inside a closet. He said he begged them not to harm his family, that he told them where the cash was, that he hoped complying would save Caroline and their child. But the chaos didn't end. Caroline screamed as one of the intruders held a gun toward the baby's face. Babish said he heard her begging, pleading, trying desperately to protect their daughter. He said he fought against the restraints, but the rope tightened around his neck until the world around him faded. Then, in his version of events, everything went quiet. He said he blacked out. When he came to, the house was still again. The intruders were gone. The air was heavy, and the only sound left inside the home was the cry of an 11-month-old child. Unable to speak through the tape covering his mouth, Babish claimed he began crawling toward his phone. It took him nearly 30 minutes. Bit by bit, inch by inch, until he reached it. At 6:11 a.m., a call was placed to emergency services. A call made, according to him, with nothing but his nose. The operator heard only muffled words, fragments of a man saying, "Help, robbers, my wife." Police were dispatched immediately. As officers climbed the steps leading into the house, they walked into a scene that froze them in place. Drawers pulled open, clothes thrown across the floor. A security camera ripped from the wall and dropped on the couch. A Monopoly box on the table, now empty. On the stairs hung the lifeless body of the family's young husky, killed with its own leash. In the bedroom, Babish lay on the floor, bound tightly, tape pressed over his mouth and eyes. Beside him stood the crib, and on the bed, face down motionless, was Caroline. Her daughter sat next to her, crying softly, patting her mother's shoulder as if trying to wake her. Doctors could do nothing. Caroline was gone. Her skin was pale, her body cold. Her life ended in those early hours, long before the police arrived. It was a scene that shook the officers, a scene none of them would forget. A mother dead, a child untouched but terrified, a husband tied up and trembling, and a house that looked like it had been turned upside down by violence. Within minutes, the story reached their superiors. A brutal home invasion, a young mother killed, a baby nearly harmed, a husband barely alive. It was a tragedy that immediately captured attention. But as investigators would soon learn, nothing inside that house was as simple as it appeared. Because while the scene looked chaotic, some of the details didn't fit. In the days that followed, questions began to form, quiet questions at first. Questions the public didn't hear. Questions the husband didn't expect. Questions that would eventually uncover a truth far more shocking than anyone imagined. When the sun began to rise over the suburb of Glycanera, the house was no longer just a home. It had become a crime scene filled with questions no one could answer yet. Detectives stepped carefully around the rooms, documenting every overturned chair, every scattered piece of clothing, every mark on the floor. The air was still, heavy with the aftermath of what they believed had been a violent invasion. Their first theory formed quickly. 3 intruders had forced their way in. A 4th had waited outside as lookout. The group entered through a basement window, searched the house, found the hidden cash, and left chaos in their wake. There was no sign of the dog being poisoned or tranquilized. She had been killed deliberately, an act the investigators understood as an attempt to control the home, to silence any warning. The path of destruction looked deliberate, almost rehearsed. A camera had been torn from the wall. The memory card was gone. Jewelry boxes sat empty, and the Monopoly box, once filled with the couple's savings, lay open and bare. Detectives walked through the rooms and mapped the intruders' supposed movements. From the basement to the staircase, from the staircase to the bedroom, from the bedroom to the closet where the money was hidden. Every trace of the night was captured in photographs and notes. And the husband, Babish, repeated the same details again and again. He described the men as aggressive, impatient, focused solely on money. He described their accents. He described the guns he claimed they carried, one black, one silver. With his wife's funeral approaching, investigators pushed themselves to find answers quickly. This was no ordinary case. The public was frightened. Families across Athens feared that the same intruders could strike again. News outlets broadcast warnings, and residents locked their doors earlier than usual. Police searched the area surrounding the home, looking for footprints, tire tracks, any sign of an escape route. They reviewed hours of security footage from nearby businesses. On one recording, they spotted a dark-colored car moving slowly through the neighborhood in the early morning hours. Behind it, a motorcycle trailing at a steady distance. Was this coincidence? Or the escape team? The footage wasn't clear enough to identify anyone, but it was enough to fuel the belief that a coordinated group had planned the attack carefully. Detectives expanded their search. They looked into local criminal networks, combing through lists of past offenders and break-in specialists. Within days, they had a list of more than 100 possible suspects. Slowly, they narrowed it down. One name stood out, a Georgian national with a long history of violent robberies. He had recently been involved in break-ins that resembled the one at Caroline's home. He had ties to organized groups known for targeting houses with cash hidden inside, and one of his past crimes involved entering through a rear window, just like the one found tampered at the Crouch home. Then came the moment that seemed to confirm everything. During a routine border check, this man was stopped while trying to leave Greece. He carried a fake passport. He matched the physical description Babish had given earlier, and he became the chief suspect in Caroline's murder. Officers transported him to Athens and questioned him for days. He was pressured, confronted, shouted at. Investigators demanded to know why he did it, how he entered the home, where he went afterward. But no matter what they asked, he gave the same response. He said he had never heard of Caroline Crouch. He insisted he had never been near their house. And behind his words was the one detail that troubled the detectives. There was no DNA linking him to the scene. No fingerprints. No footprints. Nothing. The longer they interrogated him, the more the case began to slip through their hands. This man was not their answer. As pressure mounted from the public and the media, detectives felt the frustration of chasing shadows. A young mother had been killed. Her daughter had been inches away. And every hour without answers felt like a failure. Officers were demoted. The case grew colder by the day. And still, the country believed the killers were out there somewhere, masked, armed, and free. Yet inside the investigation room, a different thought was forming. A quiet thought. One that no one dared say aloud at first. What if the attack had not happened the way it appeared? What if the story they had been told, the story everyone had accepted, wasn't the truth? What if the danger wasn't outside the house at all? Because as investigators returned to the scene, looked again at the window, the disturbed shelves, the scattered belongings, something felt off. And soon a single detail, small, almost invisible, would become the thread that pulled everything apart. Detectives returned to the house again and again, walking the same rooms they had walked on the morning of the murder. But this time, they weren't looking for intruders. They were looking for answers that fit the story they had been told. And slowly, they found questions instead. The first was the basement window. According to the husband, this was the entry point. But when investigators measured it carefully, they realized something unsettling. The window was far too narrow for a man of the size Bobish had described. The intruder sketch, tall, heavy-set, broad shoulders, didn't match the space. Even a smaller adult would struggle to slip through without disturbing the frame. Yet the frame was intact. The dust around the edges was untouched, and the marks on the sill didn't match a hurried break-in. It was their first sign that something wasn't aligning. The second sign came from the neighbors. They were awake early that morning. They remembered hearing one thing clearly, the couple's dog crying in distress. But they never heard loud footsteps. They never heard furniture being thrown. They never heard drawers ripped open or objects hitting the floor. And they certainly never heard Caroline scream. For a house that supposedly had been torn apart by violent intruders, the night had been unusually silent. Then came the security camera. The memory card had been removed. Not stolen, removed. Detectives analyzed the system closely. It didn't take long to uncover a detail the husband never mentioned. The memory card had been taken out at 1:20 a.m. hours before the time Bobish claimed the intruders entered. This wasn't a robber's mistake. This was done by someone inside the house, long before the chaos began. Investigators noted the time down quietly. They didn't confront him yet. They wanted more. And they got it. The next breakthrough came from Caroline's smartwatch, a simple device she wore every night. On the screen, a timeline appeared. A timeline that didn't care about excuses or stories. A timeline that showed exactly what happened inside her body. 3:58 a.m., her heart rate was steady. She was asleep. 4:05 a.m., her heart rate surged sharply. A sign of fear. A sign of struggle. For 11 a.m., the reading dropped. Then stopped. Caroline had died. And this was earlier than the time her husband claimed the attackers arrived. At the same time, detectives checked the data from a fitness app on Bobish's phone. The app tracked steps and movement throughout the night. It recorded walking, pacing, shifting around the house, all while he insisted he was bound, unconscious, and unable to move. The question now wasn't whether the story was wrong. The question was how much of it had been invented. Still, investigators needed one more piece, something objective, something beyond timestamps and logs. They attempted to recreate what he claimed he did that morning. Bobish said he dialed emergency services using only his nose, while bound tightly with rope and tape. Several officers tried it. None succeeded. The room fell quiet. Everything they had been told, everything the public had been led to believe, everything the grieving husband had cried about on camera. None of it matched the truth that was slowly revealing itself. Now detectives looked at the house differently. They looked at Bobish differently. They looked at the pictures of the family dog, the inconsistencies in the knots, the positioning of his body, the timing of the distress signals on Caroline's watch. Piece by piece, the story changed. The chaos in the house no longer looked like the work of strangers. It looked arranged. It looked calculated. It looked staged. And for the first time, investigators began saying the words they had avoided from the beginning. We need to look closer at the husband. Quietly, carefully, without alerting him, they built their case. And all they needed now was the moment to confront him with everything he claimed could not be questioned. That moment would come soon. And when it did, the mask he wore so convincingly finally slipped. While investigators searched for answers outside the home, Another truth waited inside a simple notebook Caroline kept close to her. It was her diary, a place where she wrote the words she didn't say. A place where she admitted fear, doubt, and moments she tried to hide from everyone around her. A place where she spoke honestly, without worrying about how it might sound, or who might misunderstand her. At first glance, it looked like any young woman's journal. Handwriting in the margins, dates scattered across pages, mentions of everyday life, small arguments, plans for the future. But as detectives read further, the tone shifted. Behind the photos of smiling faces, behind the romantic captions, behind the story of a couple building a life together, was something else. Caroline wrote about fights that left her shaken. Arguments that escalated beyond normal disagreements. Tension that grew stronger as time went on. She wrote about wanting space, wanting peace, wanting at times to leave. In one entry, she described a serious argument with Babish in 2019. She wrote that she planned to go to her sister's home because she could not continue like this. She never posted that on Instagram. She never told the world she was struggling. The diary showed a pattern, moments where she felt overwhelmed, controlled, or simply unhappy. Moments that contradicted the perfect image the couple shared with everyone else. She wrote about money. Her mother sent her small amounts to help with expenses, but Caroline confided that Babish took it from her. She felt dependent, trapped in a life she wasn't sure she had chosen freely. Then came the entry after her daughter was born. A moment when most new mothers are filled with hope and joy. But Caroline wrote something different. She said she wanted to leave again, that the relationship hurt her, but she stayed because her daughter deserved two parents. She didn't want her baby to grow up in a broken home. Her words were heavy, filled with pain she carried alone. Another entry marked a turning point. She wrote about a house in Athens, a place she mentioned wanting to escape to. Somewhere she felt she might find peace if she could just get away long enough to breathe. These were not the words of a woman living a fairy tale. They were the words of a young mother trying to hold herself together, trying to believe things would get better, trying to protect her child while wrestling with thoughts she didn't share. Her diary became the clearest window into her world, a world that differed sharply from the polished image her husband presented to friends, neighbors, and the public. Detectives read every line, and with every page, the facade of a perfect marriage faded. Then came one more discovery. Hours before she died, Caroline searched for hotel rooms. A place to take her daughter. A place to leave the house, even if only for a night. She messaged a friend that she was thinking of leaving again. She was frustrated. She was afraid. She was tired. Her last written thoughts showed a woman trying to find a way out, and those words, written quietly and privately, carried more weight than any smiling photograph or rehearsed story. Caroline's diary didn't just reveal cracks in the relationship. It revealed a truth her husband tried to bury under lies and staged chaos. It revealed the fear she lived with, the emotional distance that grew stronger each month, the effort she made to protect her child, the hope she held onto until she no longer could. Her diary spoke for her when she couldn't speak anymore. And once investigators read her final entries, they no longer saw a grieving widower. They saw a man with something to hide. Now all they needed was the moment to confront him. A moment that would arrive on a quiet island, during a memorial meant to honor the woman whose words would help uncover the truth. 37 days passed. 37 days of interviews, news coverage, speculation, and a husband who stood at the center of it all, grieving, speaking to the media, thanking supporters, urging police to keep searching. And then came the memorial. A small gathering on Alanissos. Caroline's friends, neighbors, and her family stood together in the place where she grew up, the island she loved, surrounded by the sea she once played in as a child. White flowers were placed gently around her photograph. Her parents stood close, holding on to each other for strength. The sound of church bells drifted over the village. And near the back of the crowd stood two men who didn't come to mourn. They were detectives. They watched Babish as he comforted people, as he held his daughter, as he spoke softly to Caroline's mother and father. They watched every gesture, every expression. They weren't looking for grief. They were looking for certainty. Because by now they had the timeline. They had the smartwatch data. They had the fitness app. They had the inconsistencies, the window, the silence, the removed memory card. And they had the diary. There was nothing left to match his story. But they needed one more thing, a controlled environment where they could confront him without distraction, without the ability to slip away. So they waited. When the ceremony ended and people slowly began to leave, the detectives stepped forward. They approached Babish carefully, speaking in low voices so no one else could hear. They told him there had been a development in the investigation. They told him they needed him to come with them to help identify a man. They told him it was urgent. And Babish agreed. To everyone watching, it looked like the devoted widower was cooperating again, helping the investigation just as he had been from the beginning. But he had no idea the plan had changed. A helicopter was arranged, the same type he once flew proudly. Only this time, he wasn't the one in control. As the aircraft lifted off from the island, leaving the blue water shimmering below, detectives watched him closely. He seemed calm. He held his daughter briefly before boarding. He spoke softly. He didn't appear nervous. But he didn't know that the moment he touched down in Athens, everything would shift. When the helicopter landed, detectives escorted him straight to the homicide division. No press, no cameras, no distractions, just a room, a table, a chair, and walls closing in around the story he had been telling for more than a month. They sat him down. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't need to. Instead, they laid out the timeline created by the smartwatch. They showed him the exact moment Caroline's heart stopped. They showed him the data from his fitness app, the steps he took, the minutes he moved, the times that contradicted every part of his version. They showed him the footage showing the memory card removed hours before the supposed break-in. They showed him the marks on the window that proved no one entered through it. They brought up the neighbors' statements, the silence in the night, the absence of any noise that matched a violent struggle. Everything he claimed to have seen was impossible. Everything he claimed happened was misaligned. Everything he told the world was collapsing. The interrogation lasted 8 hours. Detectives kept their tone steady, their words deliberate, each question narrowing the walls around him. And at some point, after hours of contradiction, evidence, and silence, Babish stopped talking. Then he lowered his head, and the mask he had worn so easily, so convincingly, so publicly fell apart. He began to confess, not with honesty, not with full acceptance, but with a story built to shift blame, to soften responsibility, to frame himself as a man who lost control. Detectives listened, but they already knew the truth. A truth that no intruder ever carried into that house. A truth Caroline never got to speak. A truth her smartwatch recorded minute by minute. Until it stopped. The moment he confessed, everything changed. The grieving husband who stood over her grave. The man who cried on national television. The devoted father who held his child during interviews. The victim who claimed masked men destroyed his life. Was now revealed as the one who destroyed hers. When the confession finally came, it did not arrive as a single statement. It came in pieces. Fragments of truth wrapped in excuses, half-truths, and attempts to soften what he had done. But detectives let him talk, because now they already knew the real timeline. Babish began by saying the fighting started the night before. He claimed the tension in the house had grown. He said Caroline was frustrated, exhausted, overwhelmed. He said she wanted to take their daughter and leave. He told investigators that this pushed him past a limit, that he panicked, that he lost control. Detectives sat quietly. They didn't interrupt. They didn't correct him. They waited for the moment he would finally say the words himself. And he did. He admitted that there were no intruders, no group of armed men, no masked killers breaking into the home. He admitted that everything the world had believed for 37 days had been constructed by him. The argument in the early hours escalated. Caroline tried to walk away. She tried to protect her daughter. She tried to shield herself. He followed her. He held her down, pressed a pillow against her face, used his full weight, and kept pressing. Caroline fought, long enough to leave marks, long enough to bruise, long enough for her smartwatch to record her heart racing, then stopping. 6 minutes. 6 minutes of struggle. 6 minutes he never mentioned in the dramatic interviews he later gave to the press. When she stopped moving, the house fell silent. In that silence, he made a choice. Instead of calling for help, he began creating a scene he believed would protect him. He knew exactly where the cash was hidden. He knew how to make the house look searched. He knew how to scatter belongings in every room. He went downstairs and killed the family's dog, a young husky named Roxy, hanging her with her own leash to make the scene appear violent and hopeless. He removed the memory card from the security camera. He placed items around the floor in patterns that resembled a rushed invasion. He moved objects, opened drawers, knocked over furniture. Then he turned to the final step. He positioned himself on the bedroom floor. He wrapped tape over his own mouth and eyes. He tied his own ankles and wrists loosely enough that he could eventually reach his phone, but tightly enough that first responders would believe he was helpless. And then, in a decision that investigators would revisit repeatedly, he placed his 11-month-old daughter next to the body of her mother, left to cry in the dark. With everything arranged, he waited. He crawled to his phone using movements far more controlled than the panic he later described. And at 6:11 a.m., he called emergency services. He mimicked fear. He mourned on camera. He held his child at the funeral. He thanked police publicly. He accepted sympathy from an entire country, all while knowing that the murder had not come from outside the house. It had come from him. In the interrogation room, his explanations drifted between regret and justification. He spoke of arguments, of pressure, of emotional strain. He tried to paint himself as someone overwhelmed, someone who snapped, someone who didn't plan it. But detectives already had the timeline. He removed the camera card hours before the fight. He staged the break-in methodically. He used the chaos of the scene to mislead the investigation. He had a month-long performance prepared for the world. This wasn't the story he wanted to tell, but the evidence left no room for anything else. Caroline's smartwatch recorded the exact minute her life ended. His phone recorded the exact minutes he moved around the house afterwards. And the silence of the neighborhood recorded something too. There were no shouts, no break-in, no voices of intruders, only the sound of a dog crying, and then nothing. By the time Babish finished confessing, the detectives already knew what the world was about to learn. The case that gripped a nation wasn't a robbery. It wasn't a violent home invasion. It wasn't the work of strangers at all. It was the final act in a long cycle of control, isolation, and fear. And the man who played the grieving husband so convincingly was the one who ended Caroline's life. When the confession became public, the image of the broken widower shattered instantly. The man who cried at the funeral, who held his daughter close, who spoke gently about the love of his life, had built an entire story meant to mislead an entire country. Now the world watched as he was escorted into court, no longer as a grieving husband, but as the defendant in one of Greece's most shocking cases. The trial drew enormous attention. Journalists filled the steps outside the courthouse. Camera shutters clicked relentlessly. People gathered behind barriers, waiting to see the man who fooled them step into the courtroom. But inside, behind the noise and the headlines, there was a quieter scene. Caroline's parents sat together. Her father's expression steady, her mother holding on to anything that gave her strength. They had lost their daughter in the most brutal way imaginable. And now, they were here to listen to the details of how her life was taken one sentence at a time. The charges were read aloud. Premeditated murder, obstruction of justice, providing false information to authorities, animal abuse. Each charge carried its own weight. Each one painted a clearer picture of what had happened inside that home. Prosecutors presented the evidence that had unraveled his story. The smartwatch showing Caroline's final moments, the removed memory card, the movements on his fitness app, the untouched window, the quiet neighborhood, the staged chaos, the planning involved. They described the 6 minutes Caroline fought for her life. They described the dog he killed to make the story convincing. They described how he tied himself up, placed his baby beside her mother's body, and waited for the moment he would call for help. Witnesses spoke. Experts testified. Detectives explained the timeline in calm, measured words. And through it all, Babish sat in silence. He did not cry the way he cried for cameras. He did not comfort anyone. He did not show the grief he once performed. The courtroom listened as Caroline's diary was read aloud. Her private fears, her doubts, her hope that things might improve, her longing to protect her daughter. Her words filled the room in a way she never could in life. And every person listening realized the weight she carried long before the night she died. The prosecution argued that this was not a sudden act of anger. This was a pattern of control, manipulation, and isolation that escalated over time. A pattern that ended in the only way it could have, once Caroline threatened to leave. The defense attempted to shift blame onto stress, emotion, lack of judgment. But the evidence was too strong. The timeline too exact. The planning too deliberate. After weeks of testimony, the verdict was delivered. Guilty. Guilty of murder. Guilty of deceiving authorities. Guilty of staging the crime. Guilty of every act that followed the moment Caroline took her last breath. The judge sentenced him to life imprisonment, with additional years for his lies and for the cruelty inflicted on the family dog. Caroline's parents left the courtroom quietly. No celebration, no relief. Just the weight of finality, and the knowledge that the truth had finally been spoken aloud. As officers led Babish out of the building, the crowd outside fell silent. The man who once appeared on national television as a devastated husband now disappeared behind the doors of a prison van. The same eyes that once pitted him now saw him for who he was. And with the sentence handed down, one chapter of Caroline's story came to an end. But the impact of her life, and the tragedy of her loss, would continue far beyond that courtroom. When the trial ended and the sentence was delivered, the world slowly turned its attention elsewhere. But for Caroline's family, the weight of her absence settled into every corner of their lives. They returned to Alanissos, the island where Caroline took her first steps, where she learned to swim, where she laughed under the sun as a child. An island that once held her happiest memories, now carried the heaviest ones. It was here, surrounded by the same sea she loved, that her daughter was brought to grow up. A little girl too young to understand anything except the faces of the people who held her close. Greek authorities granted full custody to Caroline's. They made a promise to raise her with gentleness, to surround her with comfort, to protect her from the darkness of the story she was born into. One day, she will learn the truth. But for now, she is simply a child, running on the same sandy paths her mother once did, laughing the same innocent laugh Caroline had when she was young. Her grandparents give her everything they can. Walks by the water at sunset, stories about her mother's kindness, photos of a brighter time, and the safety she deserves. On certain quiet days, you can find them near the shore. A small hand clutching her grandfather's fingers. A grandmother brushing the wind from her granddaughter's hair. Moments filled with love, the kind Caroline always wanted for her child. And far from this island, in a cell behind thick concrete walls, the man responsible lives out his sentence. No interviews, no cameras, no applause for the performance he once gave. Only the reality of the life he chose for himself, and the silence he created. Caroline's story did not fade. It sparked conversations across Greece and beyond, about control, manipulation, and the quiet signs of suffering that often go unnoticed. Her diary, her courage, and her final attempts to protect her daughter became the voice she never had the chance to use. She is remembered not for the tragedy alone, but for the life she lived before it. A bright young woman with dreams, joy, and a love for the sea. A devoted mother. A daughter cherished deeply. A soul taken long before her time. Each year, her family gathers near the water where she once swam. They speak her name. They honor her memory. They keep her alive in the stories they tell her daughter. Caroline may be gone, but her legacy remains, in awareness, in change, and in the child she left behind. And as this story comes to an end, take a moment to honor her memory, protect those around you, and stay aware of the signs that too often go unnoticed. If you've been watching this far, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, so more stories like Caroline's can continue to be told, remembered, and learned from.